morning, everyone, and welcome to Saturdays with Summer, everyone's favorite talk show. I, of course, am Summer Patterson, and welcome to today's show. We're going to have a great time. Just to review, last week we had the one and only Dr. Brett Criswell with us, who talked about how to make projects more fun, not only for your student, but for your teacher as well. Hopefully then the teacher won't get as bored and, maybe boost up the grade a little bit. So I hope you learned some great tricks. We're actually going to talk about a couple of those today because today we're continuing with our topic of teaching and moving into a very important lesson that all teachers need to know about, and that is questioning. The art of questioning is something that happens in all of our day-to-day lives, but especially teachers. If you think about it, probably about 80% of what teachers are saying ends up being a question. All the time they have to make sure that what they're saying to students makes sense. They need to know what students know, and they're asking for students about their content knowledge. So I decided that I was going to step into the shoes of a teacher and try out some questioning. I did this by visiting Edith J. Hayes Middle School in Lexington, Kentucky, where I met with Molly and Connor, two wonderful 6th grade students, and I decided that I would tackle a question of what is global warming? Big question, and a lot of us adults can't even answer it. And we've watched clips before where government officials have had trouble answering this question, and I'm sure many of you out in the audience today still cannot completely answer that. But yet it's one of those words that we hear about all the time. So I figured I'd take a interview and see what these students had to say about global warming. Now we know there's a lot of misconceptions out there with global warming, and I also had checked and made sure that these students hadn't yet done a lesson on global warming or climate change, because I really wanted to see what they were able to pull out of just their own personal experiences with hearing the word global warming, and how they were able to piece that together, or maybe they actually had known about it just from outside of school. So, with each of them, I asked them the first question: what is global warming? Just a big question, something a lot of teachers would probably do just to figure out prior knowledge with their students. As I mentioned, prior knowledge is a big deal. You're going to hear it from all these different areas, whether it be, your mom or your dad talked about it, you saw a clip on TV, you've been seeing commercials of polar bears out in the middle of an ocean, just surrounded by water because all their ice has melted, those kinds of things. So Molly was my first interview, and she responded to this question with something along the lines of talking about recycling and how it's important that we don't have trash all over the world. So as she's telling me this, I could kind of see these gears turning in her mind. It looked like she was thinking of something in particular that she had heard about before and almost picturing something. So I asked her, have you talked about this in an assembly before? She said they had, and I was like, okay, well, tell me about that assembly. What else did they talk to you about? So she mentioned global warming. She talked about solar energy and not littering. So she had a lot of these environmental issues going on and how they relate to young students' lives. And I guess they mentioned global warming at this assembly, so she therefore assumed that all these were somehow related. Something that I think many of us would do. And as we talked about it, she mentioned how there's so much trash being built up on the earth that wind can't get through, and the wind gets trapped, or else it's harder for the wind to move, and therefore the earth is warming up because the air can't circulate as well. So I was exploring these questions and doing my best to keep my own opinions aside and let her really figure out what she was thinking. And with this past experience that she had heard about global warming, how does that all relate to what she knew? It was also interesting to hear her tie in stuff she had been learning about her science class presently. I believe it was just the past week they had been talking about different air masses. So then she was telling me, okay, well, she showed me with her hands, hot air rises and cool air sinks, And this was something that I had seen. They had been talking about fronts and when fronts collide, so she was doing the same sort of hand motions and trying to relate those to global warming. Okay, well, if we're talking about warm air, then, something must be related. And I think as teachers, it's very important to make clear, sort of distinguish between your different topics clearly and show how they are related, how we're going to transition into the next one, but also clearly explain, yes, maybe we did talk about hot air, but that's not going to impact us in the same way that, for example, green gases are when we discuss climate change and global warming. And I know they hadn't talked about this before, but if I were to be teaching that class and we were moving on to climate change, that's something that would be essential for me to do. Yes, we talked about hot air and circulating, but I need you to put that on hold because I'm going to explain what these greenhouse gases are, and don't think of that, influencing a buildup of hot air, so to say. Now, we explored that, and it was quite different to then interview Connor after with Molly, because his first response was that global warming had to do with factories and different people who work in factories. Something a little more along the lines of what I was expecting. And with this, I asked him, okay, well, what part of factories? What are we talking about? And once again, I could see these gears turning. I could see him picturing something. And he mentioned smoke. And so then my response was, are you thinking of those big chimneys where like all the smoke's coming out and stuff? And yes. And so later we ended up discussing the Marathon factory on the border of Kentucky and West Virginia, and he had mentioned something about factories with fire. So I was like, oh, are you seeing this? He talked about oil, and he couldn't remember the company, and I was like, when you describe that, I picture the Marathon plant where they've got those large chimneys and you can see smoke coming out. He said, yes, that's exactly what he was thinking. So I think noting that Connor had been visualizing these factories, Molly had been visualizing this assembly, those are essential elements that teachers need to realize. So much of our students' prior knowledge comes from not just what they've heard before, but a lot of what they've seen before. So remember a couple weeks ago we had Temple Grandin visit with us, and she talked about the autistic mind, how it thinks a lot in pictures. Well, I think it's not just the autistic mind, and we discussed this a little bit with her. I'm sure you remember. It was a great episode. And I know I personally think in pictures, and talking to these students, they think in pictures as well, picturing assemblies, picturing buildings they've seen before, and different types of smoke. And one of the students had mentioned, gasoline from your cars, and talked about you can see gas while you're putting gas in your tank. And I asked them if they meant that mirage sort of effect. They said yes. So they were picturing that, they were visualizing that. And as teachers, understanding that when we ask students questions, they're visualizing something most of the time, we need to realize that we have to provide them with visuals to be able to latch these concepts onto. Whether it's going to be a movie, acting something out, or completing different graphic organizers in your classroom. Remember, Dr. Criswell talked a lot about this project-based learning and problem-based learning, really letting our students get messy with the topic. And that's what we need to do. We need to give them something they can latch onto, not just a reading in a textbook or sitting through a boring lecture. I understand, I'm sure that's a part of many classrooms, and I'm sure if I were a teacher, I would probably have to do that a lot too. But in addition to that, we need to build off of it. Give them something where when you ask them about it in the future, after you've gone over the content, they can visualize that lesson and go back and say, oh, okay, well, it's this that's causing heat, not, as Molly mentioned, heat coming off of animals. So that goes to one thing, and this goes to the global warming topic, and helping them make that different divide between the topics. So that's smooth transitions really are essential to being a successful teacher. And as I went through these questions, I noticed that it's really important to make sure your questions aren't leading. As adults, we're already in a more authoritative figure to these children. So if we end a question in something like, right? Or is that what you mean? they're very likely inclined to agree with whatever statement you just said, even if it's completely incorrect, and probably if it's the opposite of what they just said, they might just say, and go along with it. And I know personally, I made those mistakes a couple of times. I'd end a question with, right? Or it'd be like, I just want to make sure that's what you're saying, right? Even though it may have been exactly what they had just said, just adding those small keywords can completely change their mindset to go along with it. And as you continue to ask questions, they may counteract what they've said before. So it's all about learning how to build off of that. And I know I lost the opportunity. There were some great moments where I should have expanded on what they had just said and been like, wait a second, let's break that down. Or, let's take a couple steps back here and see how that relates to what you just said before. And, like I mentioned, they didn't know very much about this topic, so a lot of this was just piecing bits and pieces together, which is totally fine, and that's why it was very interesting to watch their thought process work. But especially as teachers, if we're trying to understand this prior knowledge, it's essential to make those connections, because this can also help students unweave some of their misconceptions, I think is how I want to say that, where they can unravel these different bits and pieces and figure out, wait, that doesn't match up with this, or, well, I heard this, but these two just don't make sense at all together. And that way it makes it easier for them to let go of the misconception and understand the new content knowledge. So, with that being said, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we will be right back with more about questioning.